So glad you joined us for today's episode of Biblically Grounded. I'm your host, Clayton Van Huss, and I am joined today by a special guest, Dr. Titus Kennedy of the Discovery Institute. And Dr. Kennedy is, well, he's an adventurer, he's a professor, he's a researcher, an archaeologist extraordinaire. Titus, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Clayton. It's good to be here.
Good, good. So I'm glad to have you. And you are known as a man of adventure, are you not?
Oh, some people say that.
Okay, good. Well, I want to ask you some things about that. Let's start off with you telling us a bit about yourself. So you're an archaeologist. Uh, how did that happen? How did you get into archaeology in the first place?
I got into archaeology really through an interest in both history and the sciences. And that started way back in elementary school when I started to read about archaeology and found out that it even existed as a separate discipline and continued to do some reading, found out more about archaeology in the Bible, biblical archaeology, became very interested in that, saw that it was apologetic value as well as helping us to understand the ancient context of the Bible. And eventually I decided I'll try to study that in college. So I went to university and started taking some archaeology courses and worked on some digs in California and continued to pursue the master's degrees and doctorate and working at several sites in the Middle East and publishing, eventually teaching in the field of biblical archaeology.
Okay, so there's a lot going on there. You mentioned that archaeology is an apologetics, a branch for apologetics. Can you explain that to our viewers and our listeners? How does that work? First of all, what's apologetics? And second of all, how does archaeology fit into that? Because that's a big part of what we do here, and I'd love to hear your definitions.
Well, the word apologetics that we use comes from First Peter 3:15, and it means defense. So it's a defense of the faith that we're looking at reasons to believe, reasons that Christianity is true, that the Bible is true. And archaeology is one of the disciplines that provides some of those reasons, some of those answers. We have evidence of the historical accuracy of the Bible through archaeology, through both the Old and New Testaments.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to talk to you in this episode about some Old Testament archaeology. I want to talk about a period where there's a lot of discussion, a lot of disagreement, even amongst believers and scholars in the field. And there are arguments and debates, and we're not going to get into that today. I really just want to kind of leave that out. But I do want to talk to you about the time of the Exodus. I want to talk to you about what we see in the ground. And I understand that you took a very interesting expedition in relation to this subject. So I do want to get into that. But first of all, can you set the stage for us historically for the Exodus? You know, we look in the Bible and we get it like in a Sunday school flannel graph kind of way, but looking at it as a serious historian and an archaeologist, can you give us the setting in history?
Sure. So the setting in history, or in archaeological terms, is going to be in what's called the late Bronze Age, since they're coming out of Egypt. Well, we should mention in Egyptian history, this would be the New Kingdom, and I would place this in the 18th dynasty. So we might ask, why can we be that specific? The 18th dynasty or late Bronze Age one, and that's because in the Old Testament we have at least two pretty solid, useful passages for helping us determine the timing of the Exodus. 1 Kings 6:1 is a very well-known passage because it gives us a time frame in years between the Exodus and the fourth year of Solomon when he started to build the temple. And it tells us that his fourth year was the 480th year after the Exodus. And because we know when Solomon's reign was, and there's really not disagreement about that, we're able to calculate back to somewhere around 1446 BC for the Exodus. We might look at Judges 11:26, which I think corroborates this timeline. And Jephthah is giving a historical recounting of Israel's time in the Promised Land, and he says that they've been there 300 years.
Yeah.
And we can put Jephthah about 1100 BC,
Can,
just a bit before the time of Saul.
okay, can I interrupt you for a moment on that? So that is one thing, that I've been taught. We can put him, and of course, this is the judge who told God that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his gates, which of course turned out to be his daughter. And there's a whole big story there. Maybe sometime we can talk about that kind of stuff. So we date him around, you said around 1100 BC. That's about 100 years before David was reigning in
Hmm.
Israel.
Right.
Why do we put him there?
Just looking at the chronology of Judges, we're somewhere in that period. We're very close to the time that Abimelech destroyed Shechem, which is probably about 1125 BC. So he's coming just after that time. I don't think we can say that it's exactly 1100.
Mhm.
It's pretty hard to pinpoint him, but within a decade probably we're on target. And so he's telling us 300 years before his time, about 1400 BC, the Israelites had come into the Promised Land. Well, we read about the wandering period of 40 years, 4 decades, and we get back again to about 1440 BC for the Exodus. So, very, very similar time frame there.
Yeah, so we get these collaborations in the Old Testament that point us to this era, to this time frame. So we're looking at the Israelites leaving Egypt here at this point in the 18th dynasty. Can you tell us a little something about that 18th dynasty? I mean, to an historian, an archaeologist, okay, I'm able to put the pieces together, but what does that mean to the layperson?
The 18th dynasty was a new dynasty that reunited northern and southern, or upper and lower Egypt. This started with Ahmose the first. He had come up from the south and he fought against the Hyksos dynasty, who had been ruling lower Egypt for a while, at least a century. And he reunited Egypt again under one king. And so we start a whole new royal line at that point. And I think this was probably the king who did not know Joseph. Because he had no connection to Joseph. And he starts to institute this widespread policy of slavery against Asiatics, or people from Western Asia, including Semites. And so this fits very well with what we read in Exodus, with the slave labor imposed upon the Israelites. This became quite a powerful dynasty. Egypt was expanding its influence. And then we had some very, very interesting events happening later on in this dynasty, which may be a result of the Exodus.
Hmm. Now that sounds very interesting. You're kind of teasing at something here. So we have this Pharaoh who comes in. He chases out. You said he chased out the Hyksos. Can you tell us who they were?
Well, there's not absolute disagreement on this, but the Hyksos seem to be people who had come in from Western Asia, from Canaan. They had migrated into Egypt, or in some people's versions, they actually attacked Egypt, but come into Egypt and they settled in Lower Egypt in the Nile Delta region, and they slowly gained power, or maybe suddenly took it, and then they started their own dynasty of kings ruling in northern Egypt.
Okay, so they kind of set up shop there in Egypt, and they controlled things in Lower Egypt, which is northern Egypt. That's very confusing, um, but that's the way it goes. And so Ahmose comes in and chases them out. And these are Semites, as far as we know, people from the Levant, maybe the same
Right.
stock as the Israelites, at
Mm.
least to some degree. And so, is this why he enslaves the Semitic people?
Seems to be. It seems from a meta narrative that he is having beef with these people from Western Asia, and the Israelites are part of that. And so, to get back at them, so to speak, from them taking over Egypt for a century or so, he decides he's going to enslave all the ones that are around and make them work for the Egyptians. And the Israelites get caught up in that. There doesn't seem to be any animosity directed particularly towards the Israelites before this.
Yeah, and then the Bible tells us that the Pharaoh was afraid that Israel would join with the enemies of Egypt, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting. We see an historical thing here where we have a verisimilitude, as we say, between the historical record, also the archaeological record, and the Bible. So we see some interesting things happening. So we've got them now as slaves under this interesting 18th dynasty. So, do we see any indication of that in the land of Egypt? Is there any place where we might find the Israelites?
I do think so. I think we have some archaeological material culture type of evidence related to the Israelites, as well as some written documents in Egyptian papyri. I would point to Papyrus Brooklyn as one of those things where we have several biblical Hebrew names shown on a list of household servants or household slaves from, oh, probably 200 years before the Exodus, somewhere in there. Then we have uh, some of the cities in this lower Egypt, northern Egypt, Nile Delta region. We've got material culture that fits with the Israelites. That is, they are Semites, people who have migrated in from Canaan. They have different types of pottery and burial practices, house structure, things like that, as well as inscriptions in a Semitic language. Basically, we could call it Canaanite, and then Hebrew comes out of that eventually. So we have a lot of indicators of people like the Israelites, as well as I think some specific evidence that points to their presence in Egypt before the Exodus.
Yeah, so we find this. In fact, the archaeologist who's done so much work on that is Manfred Bietak, and you'll see him in documentaries. You can read his reports on these sites around Avaris, and which has had many different names over the years. And I think whether you believe in an early date for the Exodus or a late date, doesn't every scholar pretty much say, yeah, this is the land of Goshen. This is where the Israelites lived.
There's widespread agreement on Goshen, even on Avaris Ramses as being the site of Tel El Daba and Kontir. So that was fairly recent. If you go back a few decades, people were still not sure where that city was located. A lot of the earlier archaeologists thought that it was at Tanis, but now, thanks to BTOX excavations and others, we understand where the correct location is.
Okay, and there's all sorts of not just Semitic architecture there, but there's Royal Egyptian architecture there as well, I understand.
There is, in fact, from the 18th dynasty, there was a whole section of the city that was a royal palace or a royal district, probably better to call it. It wasn't just a palace building. It was quite large, taking up multiple acres. And then that Egyptian palace was abandoned during the reign of Amenhotep II, who I and many others think is the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
Yeah, Amenhotep II. So you and a lot of other people would hold him as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Uh, I, can you tell us a little bit about Amenhotep II? Where does he fit in Egyptian history? Who is he? What's he like? And why would you look to him as the possible pharaoh of the Exodus?
Amenhotep II was one of the sons of this famous pharaoh Thutmose III or Thutmosis III. However, he wasn't the firstborn son, which I think is important when we're looking at the Exodus narrative and the death of the firstborn and the final plague. Well, Amenhotep II came into power at a time when Egypt's influence was stretching very far. His father had expanded it really all the way to the Euphrates River, and they had a very powerful military. We know of 17 successful campaigns that his father conducted. But things start to change as we get into the reign of Amenhotep II. And there have been articles published about this. You can read it in books, including mine, but many different reasons why we see some circumstantial evidence of Amenhotep II as the Exodus pharaoh. This abandoning of the palace, the fact that his military campaigns cease after the beginning of his reign. He conducts a slave raid into Canaan and claims to take back over 100,000 prisoners as new slaves. There's some things going on with anger against the gods, possibly destroying statues or idols of the gods. But I think one of the most compelling and very easy to understand reasons is that in the writings of Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest historian who lived in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, he records or he discusses this exodus of people that we can identify as the Hebrews, the Israelites, because it says they go to Jerusalem and eventually build a temple. It's quite clear. But he tells us that the name of the king during this exiting from Egypt was Amenephis or Amenhotep.
Yeah, that's
And
that's the Greek name because at this period in ancient Near East history, we have a huge Greek influence all over the place.
right. And so he gives us the name there, and we don't know the exact source of his information, but he did have access to writings that we no longer have. I mean, as an ancient Egyptian who was also a historian. So I think his testimony is quite important and reliable there. And so, as well as just the chronology lining up biblical to Egyptian chronology, some circumstantial evidence, Manetho giving us the name, and we put that all together, and it seems to be a pretty compelling case.
Yeah, yeah, it does. We see so many things line up, and you start to pull together these little pieces here and there of just evidence that's coming out of writings. There's epigraphical evidence. There's archaeological evidence. So these things are coming together to paint us a pretty good picture of the time and place that the Exodus happened there along the Nile Delta, maybe during the 18th dynasty. So the Israelites, they have to escape Egypt once the plagues come in and all of this happens and Egypt is weakened. And then the Pharaoh, presumably Amenhotep II here, follows the Israelites with his war chariots to the Red Sea. Now, what are your thoughts on the Red Sea crossing?
Uh, well, the Reed Sea crossing, we see the same terminology used in Egyptian documents of the New Kingdom, this Reed Lakes area. And I think that it was somewhere around the Bala Lakes or Lake Timsah, or maybe even the Great Bitter Lake, somewhere in that general area. Seems to be where some of the other geography points to it as well.
Sure, and that's there's a lot of controversy about that, and I know a lot of people will say, "Oh no, that's not a big enough miracle for God to part a little sea of reeds," because they hear that and they think of a marsh. What was this area, these lakes? Were they just shallow, knee deep bodies of water, or were they something else?
Well, there was a survey project done on the lakes in this area, and they came to the conclusion that back in New Kingdom period, that they were about 35 feet deep. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit because of the Suez Canal, so you can't see that in a lot of the places. But if you do go to the Great Bitter Lake, you can see it's pretty sizable. You can't just walk across that knee deep. I mean, you would have to swim a good
Mhm.
distance.
And it is indeed what we would call a sea, at especially in biblical language, and it's still connected to the Red Sea, through the waterways and things. So there's a lot of interesting discussion here. God can part any body of water that He wants, whether it's one of the gulfs of the Red Sea, whether it's a massive lake, or if He wanted to take them through the Mediterranean, He could have done that. We're talking about the God of all creation, so I don't think that this is at all limiting on God. It's still a miracle. It's still something He did. He still gets the credit for bringing the Israelites out of Egypt through such a dangerous place. So the Pharaoh, now, does the Bible indicate that the Pharaoh passed in the Red Sea incident, that he died, or what? Because I know there are different interpretations there. Where do you land on that?
I don't see any place where it states that Pharaoh died in the pursuit of the Israelites. He's almost conspicuously absent from the book of Exodus, that being mentioned. It talks about his army and his chariots, but not him. So people usually go and look at the Psalms and they see this verse that says that Pharaoh was shook off in the Red Sea, and some take that as he drowned in the Red Sea, but others just see it as that's how God got rid of him, shook him off of the Israelites' tail, so to speak. So I personally think that the Pharaoh didn't die. His army got destroyed, but he survived. He saw that. He went back to Egypt.
Okay, so now we have a situation where the Israelites, these Hebrew people, they have left Egypt, they have gotten away from their pursuers. They now reach a place where they're in the wilderness. They go to Mount Sinai. And I don't even think we need to get into that one here and now. That's not really the whole point of this discussion. That's a huge one, I think, for we can do a whole series of episodes on. But so they get away. They get to Mount Sinai. They're given the law. They get to Canaan. They they disobey God. The spies go into the land and they search all the way up into Syria and way down there, and they're looking at the whole land, and they come back and they say, no, we can't do this. And God says, fine, then you won't go in. So then they say, yeah, wait, we can do it. And then God says, don't do it. And Moses tells them, don't do it. And they did, and they were defeated handily. So then they are told, you're going to wander in the wilderness, and only your children will make it in. So we have a 40-year exodus where they are not allowed into the promised land. And so I would like to kind of zoom in on this time period. One, it's going to be hard to find archaeological evidence of nomadic people in a big deserty area. They just don't leave a trace. This is the way things go, and God clearly says that their sandals didn't wear out. And I don't know, if their other equipment did or didn't, but they're not leaving much of a trace. They're staying at some places for some time, but they're also moving. So, do we have any archaeological evidence, any artifacts that point towards this group of people wandering?
Do, in fact. This, I think, is one of the most interesting pieces of archaeological evidence connected to the Exodus and certainly to this wandering period. As you said, very difficult to find material evidence of nomad groups. You don't know exactly where to look, first of all, and then they're not going to leave much behind. Secondly, but what we have is an inscription, or actually two inscriptions, that mention a people called the Nomads of Yahweh. So this is found on an Egyptian temple from the time of Amenhotep III. So he is the grandson of Amenhotep II, and his reign was, well, it started less than 40 years after the Exodus and then went into the period of the conquest. And on this inscription, uh, not only do we have this very, very interesting phrase, these people are nomadic, as well as being connected to Yahweh, but we have some context, some geographic context. So it's near other nomad groups that are listed, and then it is near other geographical locations that would place them in somewhere around Sinai, Edom, Transjordan, possibly Canaan, west of the Jordan River. So basically, exactly where the Israelites were at the end of the wandering period, or possibly just as they entered the promised land.
Okay, so we are looking at a time here now. The Exodus has ended. It's the time of the conquest. The Pharaoh is Amenhotep III, the grandson of Amenhotep II. Now, interestingly, so his father was Thutmose IV, the son of Amenhotep II. And so we have a whole string of not firstborn sons here, don't we?
Yes, yes, we do. Thutmose the Fourth had an older brother that just sort of disappeared from history. In fact, my personal view is that his older brother's mummy was inside the tomb of his father, Weben Senu, as a young boy, and he's the one that died during the plagues. Others think it might have been a different son, but we do know that Thutmose IV was not the firstborn, and so he essentially appealed to divine authority, or a propagandistic narrative of divine authority, that he was all along planned by the gods, just to be this next pharaoh.
Yeah, and he left some evidence of that at the Great Sphinx, didn't he?
Yes, yeah, on the Sphinx dream stele.
Wow, that's some interesting stuff there. So, so we have these pharaohs. We have this historical period that seems to match up very well with what we read in Scripture. And at this point, at the end of the Exodus, we have a mention on an inscription about this group of people who we call the Nomads of Yahweh. How certain are we? Because I want to talk to you about this inscription and about your involvement with it. But first of all, how certain are we that this is the name of God that is carved into this inscription?
Uh, I wouldn't say that there's universal agreement, but it is a very strong consensus that this says Yahweh and that it is the same as the Yahweh of the Bible, the divine name. And actually, we have no other name that's like that. So there's really nothing else to explain it as. There's no place name called Yahweh. There's no other person or no other deity that used the same name. So we're kind of restricted to that. And then we also have this issue of who was associated with Yahweh in ancient times, who worshiped Yahweh, and that's only the Israelites. There were no other people who ever worshiped Yahweh other than the Israelites. So we can't make the case that this was some Canaanites who had worshiped Yahweh previously, or even that they're Edomites, because that's not what we see in Edomite inscription or in Canaanite documents.
Yeah,
And
and there's a lot of talk about Edomites, about the Shasu, these nomads. Oh, they were
mhm,
just Edomites. This is the land of Yahweh. They are, and these are the descendants of Esau, right? They're south of Israel, southeast, the Dead Sea. So that's where some scholars are trying to say, well, as people over here, but they were not known to worship the God of the Hebrews at all, as you said. So
yeah,
interesting.
correct. And we even have some passages in the book of Numbers, for example, that talk about the Israelites in the same way as this phrase, the nomads of Yahweh. So we've got Numbers 16:41, it says the sons of Israel, and then calls them the people of Yahweh in the same verse. And then we've got later on in Numbers in 32:13, it says that Yahweh made Israel wander in the wilderness. So we clearly know that they're the people of Yahweh and they were wandering in the wilderness at this time. And it fits very, very well. We have no other logical or evidence-based way to explain this.
So, Titus, you've told us about this inscription that has been found that appears to have the name of God on it, talking likely, most likely, about the Hebrew people during the Exodus, the nomads of Yahweh. Where was this inscription found?
This inscription, the earliest version of it, appears twice on a temple of Amenhotep III at a place called Soleb. Now, today this is in Sudan, northern part of Sudan, but in ancient times during the Egyptian 18th dynasty, this was part of the area ruled over by Egypt. So it's very, very far south, but it is still within Egyptian jurisdiction. And specifically in the parts of the temple, it's found on a column, and then the interior of the temple, it's found on a wall where they had both had these lists of all of these places or groups of people that were supposedly subjugated or under the control of the Pharaoh. And so he's essentially just naming everybody that's within his power. And then there's a slightly later inscription that copies this one from nearby at Amara West, from probably 150 years later.
Really? Now, see, now that one you just don't hear anything about. Where is that?
It's also in northern Sudan, so it's pretty close to Soleb, but since it's not as early and it's not as well preserved, then it's usually not discussed as much.
Okay, so this is interesting. So we have this temple built. Amenhotep III has his deeds recorded on the walls and the columns and things like that in this temple, which is something pharaohs did. They about anybody did. They put these steles and things with their victories and crushing their enemies and that sort of thing. This was very important. So we have this that appears to be talking about the Israelites. Now, you personally, I understand, went on an expedition, a pretty exciting adventure to go see this. Tell us about this. What made you want to go and see this inscription in person?
I had read a little bit about this inscription and thought it was pretty incredible, but in doing research, I couldn't really find much written about it at all, and I couldn't find even one photo of the actual inscription. When I got the excavation reports of this temple, then I looked through those and they mention it briefly, but again, there's not even a photograph in the official excavation reports. There's a drawing, and in the drawing, they actually made a mistake with one of the hieroglyphs, which has kind of showed up in subsequent publications quite a bit. It doesn't affect things a lot, but I think it does make the connection to Yahweh and the spelling of the divine name that we see in the Bible or on the Mesha stele and other Hebrew inscriptions a little bit more difficult. But my objective then was to go there to photograph this, to try to find the second inscription as well that I mentioned from the wall list, and to analyze that and publish it so that things were very clear about this inscription. Sudan, of course, has been under a lot of conflict for many years, really. And there's also always a possibility that things like this could get destroyed, and then we may not have the evidence anymore. And then all we've got are some people who claim that it was there or a few drawings of it. So wanted to preserve this or record this, and then get it out there, publish it so people could see exactly what it was and what it said.
Yeah, so we do have this danger in the Near East today where we have kind of iconoclasm. We have these ISIS has gone in and destroyed various ancient sites, artifacts, and locations, and destroyed bits and pieces of inscriptions and statues. And this sort of thing happens in that part of the world. And so, yes, if we have something that mentions, well, even anything's important, any antiquity that helps us understand history better, but especially when we have something that deals with a subject that's so touchy as the Exodus. So you went on this mission. This is a mission. This isn't like a vacation. You went to preserve this for scholars for years to come, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it was not easy to get there.
Yeah.
So the normal route would be to fly into someplace like Cairo, uh, or to Saudi, and then fly from there to Khartoum in Sudan. And then once you're in Khartoum, you've got to get in an SUV because you're going to be driving off road for quite a bit of this and drive up to Solb. And you've got to also cross the Nile in doing this. So we put the car on a little ferry that didn't look very stable or in good condition and go across the Nile and get over to that western side and then go to the site. And the site is really pretty far out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there's a small village nearby, but that's about it.
Wow. So you're out there. So how many days or weeks did this excursion take?
It was about a week and a half from when I left to when I came back. So it took a couple of days just to get from Khartoum to Soleb. So the travel time was a big factor in it.
Yeah. So how remote is Soleb? Is it? I mean, like can you just go to McDonald's and eat, or are you having to pack in your own stuff, food and water? How's this working?
We had to bring our own supplies, both food and water. The water there would make most people sick unless they had grown up in the area. So we couldn't really get anything local, but I mean, there weren't there weren't really places to buy things either. So there's not stores, there's not your gas station convenience stores, anything like that around. So everything was just brought in, as well as our sleeping bags that we're sleeping in. So kind of like a little trekking expedition.
Oh, that's very interesting. So was it pretty uneventful, or were there great adventures had, or I'm really building this up, and you just might be like, ah, yeah, no, we just went and took some pictures and left. I don't know. Tell me about just some of the particulars and some of the things that really stood out to you in this area.
We didn't run into any major problems, but we had to get permits to travel through the country, and there are all these checkpoints as you're traveling through. So you roll up to this checkpoint, and then the army is there, and they've got their guns pointed at you just in case, and you've got to show them this permit. And so there's all these copies of it, and you give them the permit, and then you've got a stack of them because you're going to have to go to the next place and keep doing that. It's really hot there even in the winter. So I went in February because that's one of these windows where it's not unbearably hot and there aren't too many of these little gnats or flies that will harass you mercilessly. There's a lot of places in the Middle East that are the same. So try to pick the best time to go as far as weather and bugs, and then traveling by car, get over on the ferry boat and bring your own food, water with you, etc. I would say that we were careful about what we said and what we were doing. Didn't really want to draw any attention or cause any problems. So just trying to get to the site and then just document this inscription, photograph it, do some video as well because we had the ability to do that, and then get home and start working on publishing.
Oh, that is great. And I want to talk about publishing and the importance of that. How did you find the inscription? Was it still something you could read? Is it coming apart? Like how has it been preserved since it was discovered?
When last time I was there, you could still read it. Hopefully it's like that too, but there is some damage on it. So you had mentioned things like iconoclasm, which certainly has happened, but there's a lot of inadvertent damage as well. It could be conflict related, people shooting or mortar shells, things like that. But more often it's other things like people want building materials and they might go to these ancient sites and take the stone to use in whatever they're building. So that's happened for millennia. That can happen again. And then there's issues with graffiti as well. Sometimes people just put graffiti on things. So this one has a little bit of damage, but you can still make it out.
Well, that's
As far as the other inscription, the wall block, that one seems to be buried somewhere at the site, or maybe now it's in a storeroom in Khartoum. It's kind of lost once again. But at one point it was out there as well. So you had two inscriptions that mention the Nomads of Yahweh at the same site.
wow. So you've published, and yeah, I've seen some of the things on this that are accessible. If what is the importance of publishing a work like this? What does that do? How does that help us?
Well, one way is that now people can see high resolution photos of the actual inscription, not a drawing and not a AI version or a sort of a recreated artifact. A photo of a fake artifact had kind of been floating around the internet for a while. I mean, I don't think it was meant to be a forgery. It was an example, but it actually didn't look really anything like the actual inscription. So I wanted to get that out there so people could see, yes, this thing is real. It still exists. Here's exactly what it looks like. But then also to correct some of the mistakes, the main one being a misidentified hieroglyph, and then to discuss both the date and the geographic context of it and who this might have been talking about.
Very cool. So with your work, how has this contributed to the scholarship and the understanding of this inscription?
Actually, I've seen some other publications that came out after mine where there does seem to be a shift to accepting the corrected reading. So that's positive. And then I'm also seeing other people who they don't necessarily believe that the Bible's very historical, but they do see that this is probably connected to at least to the name Yahweh found in the Bible, if not the Israelites themselves, or maybe what some people might call proto-Israelites.
Yeah. So okay. So we've got this picture and what you've done here, this picture of the Israelites coming out of Egypt, going into Canaan, into the promised land. And now you've documented this piece of material culture that corroborates what we read in the Bible. It helps to illuminate our view of Scripture. So what is your hope for the future when it comes to this line of study? What do you want scholars, both believers and non-believers, early date Exodus, late date Exodus, people of differing opinions, what do you want your scholarship to contribute to this work?
Primarily to helping us better understand exactly when and where these things happened and that they did happen. And I assume that there will be more discoveries in the future, and that will add to our body of knowledge. But sometimes there are discoveries already out there that maybe haven't been looked at as closely as they need to be, or haven't been published much, explained, connected into the broader historical picture. And so I'm hoping to kind of contribute in helping to figure things out and to present what's out there as well as some new material.
Dr. Kennedy, we appreciate your time with us today. You've shared with us some valuable information, and you're an author. You're a teacher. You are an adventurer. You have published. I do want to share some of your works that we at Southwest Radio Ministries carry in our bookstore. Of course, one of my and these are. I have all sorts of things marked in these books. I have Unearthing the Bible, which is, I loved this book. I got this as a Christmas gift. And I had to limit myself to one artifact a day. It's a book with 101 different artifacts. And I kept it by my bedside. And every night when I went to bed, I read about one more. It was so tempting to read ahead. Also, we have the Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands. This is an excellent book. This is one of your. This is your most recent book, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Great book. Also, I've been marking it because I'm referencing some of your things in my own writings and some of the things I'm working on. So, can you tell our viewers how they can find your work on the Solb inscription, and also where they can get in touch with you, find out more about your work?
Sure. So I've got several articles published that are available online, some of them about this Nomads of Yahweh inscription. And so you can probably just type it into a search engine, or if you look at my faculty page on Shepherds, for instance, they've got links to a lot of my articles, and then books as well, Amazon or wherever you buy books online. And I do also talk about this inscription actually in my newest book, because there's a section on Egypt.
Hmm. Okay, well, that is fascinating. Dr. Kennedy, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking with you again in the very near future.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us today on Biblically Grounded.